Security, remove her. That was the first sentence I heard when I stepped into the room where my husband's life was being reduced to paperwork and signatures. And for a moment, I genuinely thought they were talking about someone else, because no one warns you that one day you'll become a stranger in your own family. I stood there in the doorway, my hand still resting on the cold brass handle, feeling every pair of eyes turn toward me, not with concern, not with grief, but with something far more distant, as if I had walked into the wrong meeting by mistake. Daniel didn't even look surprised to see me. My son, my only child, sat at the head of the long oak conference table, his posture straight, his expression composed, the same way he used to sit during school recitals when he knew I was watching. Only now, there was no warmth in his eyes. Beside him, Vanessa adjusted the sleeve of her tailored blazer, her lips pressed into a polite, almost rehearsed smile, the kind people use when they're pretending to be kind. "You shouldn't be here," she said calmly, not even raising her voice, as if she were reminding me of a forgotten appointment. I didn't respond right away. I just took a step forward, then another, my shoes echoing softly against the polished floor, each sound reminding me how out of place I had become. A week ago, I had stood in my bedroom holding a black dress, waiting for a call that never came, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell me when I could say goodbye to the man I had spent 43 years with. I had memorized the sound of silence that day, and now here I was, standing in a room full of people discussing his estate, his legacy, his life, as if I had never been part of it. "This is a private meeting," Vanessa continued, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Immediate family only." I almost laughed at that. Immediate family. The words hung in the air like something fragile, something that could shatter if touched too directly. I looked at Daniel then, really looked at him, searching for even the smallest flicker of hesitation, of doubt, of recognition. There was nothing. He leaned back slightly in his chair, avoiding my eyes, and said, "Mom, it's better if you go." Just like that. No explanation. No apology. Just a quiet dismissal, delivered with the same tone he used when he was a teenager asking me to turn off the lights before leaving his room. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't grief speaking. This was something that had been building quietly, carefully, long before my husband took his last breath. I took another step into the room anyway, ignoring the subtle shift of discomfort around the table, ignoring the way Vanessa's smile tightened ever so slightly. "I was his wife," I said, my voice steady, almost detached, as if I were stating a fact from a document rather than a life I had lived. "I think I have the right to be here." For a brief second, no one spoke. Even the attorney at the far end of the table glanced down at his papers, as if suddenly unsure of where to look. And then Vanessa exhaled softly, almost impatiently, and turned her gaze toward the door. "You heard me," she said, this time a little firmer. "Security." That was when I realized something else. I hadn't come here to argue. I hadn't come here to beg for a seat at that table. And I certainly hadn't come here to remind them of who I used to be. I had come because I needed to see it for myself. The distance, the coldness, the quiet certainty in their voices. Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it reveals itself in moments like this, small, precise, impossible to ignore. And as I stood there, watching my own son choose silence over acknowledgement, I felt something inside me settle into place. Not anger, not even heartbreak, but something colder, clearer. They thought I didn't belong there. They thought I had been left behind with everything else that no longer mattered. And for the first time since my husband passed, I stopped waiting for someone to correct that assumption. I did not argue when the guard stepped closer, not because I was afraid, but because I had already seen everything I needed to see in that room, and nothing they said after that would change it. I turned quietly, my hand brushing the edge of the table as I passed, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers, the same kind of table my husband and I had once chosen together for our dining room, back when decisions were made side by side instead of behind closed doors. No one stopped me. No one called my name. Even Daniel remained silent, his gaze fixed somewhere just beyond me, as if I had already disappeared. The hallway outside felt colder than I remembered, the air too still, too clean, like a place where nothing real was allowed to linger. I walked past framed certificates and polished walls until I reached the elevator, pressing the button with a steady hand that did not betray the quiet shift happening inside me. A week earlier, I had stood in my own kitchen at 7:30 in the morning, watching the sunlight fall across the empty chair where my husband used to sit with his coffee. I had brewed 2 cups out of habit, only realizing my mistake when the second one grew cold beside the first. That was the morning I decided I would wait. I told myself that grief made people forgetful, that arrangements could be confusing, that surely my son would call and tell me when to come, what time the service would begin, what I should bring, what I should wear. I folded and refolded the black dress I had chosen, smoothing out wrinkles that were not there, placing it carefully on the bed as if preparing for something sacred. Hours passed, then a full day, then another. Each time my phone remained silent. I found a reason to explain it away. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Maybe Vanessa was organizing everything and had not had the chance to reach out. Maybe Daniel did not want to burden me. I held on to those maybes the way a person holds on to something fragile, afraid that if I questioned them too closely, they would break. It was not until I saw the photograph that everything shifted. It appeared on my screen without warning. A smiling group gathered beneath a gray sky, dressed in black, standing in front of a place I knew too well. I recognized the arrangement of flowers, the curve of the pathway, even the way the light hit the headstones behind them. My husband's service had already happened. I stared at the image for a long time, searching for something that would make it make sense, some sign that I had misunderstood, that I had missed a message, that I had been mistaken about the date. But there it was, clear and undeniable. Daniel stood in the center, his arm resting lightly at Vanessa's back, both of them composed, collected, almost serene. There was no space left for me in that picture. I did not call. I did not ask why. I simply set the phone down on the kitchen counter and turned off the stove where I had been reheating soup I suddenly no longer wanted. The silence that followed felt different from before. It was no longer filled with waiting. It was filled with understanding. When the elevator doors opened and I stepped outside into the parking lot, the late afternoon sun felt too bright against my eyes, forcing me to pause for a moment before moving forward. I reached my car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as I looked straight ahead. A week ago, I had been waiting for an invitation that never came. Today, I had been told I did not belong. And somewhere between those two moments, something inside me had changed in a way that could not be undone. I did not start the car right away because there was something about that moment that felt too important to rush, as if turning the key would force me to move forward before I had fully understood what had just happened. So I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, watching a couple walk past in the distance, their conversation quiet and ordinary, the kind of small, everyday normalcy that used to belong to me. After a while, I reached for my purse and pulled out my phone again, not to scroll, not to search, but simply to look at it, to hold the object that had stayed silent when it mattered most. The screen reflected my face faintly, older than I remembered, but steadier in a way I had not expected. I unlocked it slowly and opened the messages, scrolling back through the past week, reading each line as if I might find something hidden between the words, something I had missed. There were short replies from Daniel, polite but distant, messages that ended conversations instead of continuing them. There was nothing about the service, nothing about arrangements, nothing that suggested I had been included at any point. It was not an oversight. It was a decision. I let that realization settle without resisting it, the way you accept the final piece of a puzzle that no longer allows for doubt. I placed the phone back into my purse and leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes for just a moment, and that was when I heard his voice. Not in the way people describe memories, not loud or overwhelming, but quiet and familiar, like the echo of something that had always been there. He had never rushed into decisions. My husband believed in clarity, in making sure everything was understood, everything accounted for. He used to say that the truth should never need to be chased, that if something felt hidden, it probably was. At the time, I had thought he was talking about business, about contracts and negotiations, the world he moved through with such careful precision. I had not realized he was also preparing me for something else. I opened my eyes and looked ahead again, the sunlight now softer, the shadows stretching longer across the pavement, and for the first time since that photograph had appeared on my screen, I allowed myself to ask a different question, not why they had done this, but how they had been able to do it so completely. A funeral does not happen overnight. There are calls to be made, arrangements to be signed, decisions about location, timing, invitations. All of it requires coordination, communication, intention. And yet, somehow, I had been left out of every single step. That kind of absence does not happen by accident. I thought back to the days leading up to it, the brief conversations, the way Vanessa had spoken for Daniel more and more, answering questions that were not directed at her, guiding discussions with a calm authority that I had once mistaken for efficiency. I remembered how Daniel had begun to defer to her in small ways, letting her finish his sentences, allowing her to redirect topics, accepting her version of events without question. At the time, it had seemed harmless, a natural shift in a marriage where one person simply took the lead. Now, it felt like something else entirely, something quieter and more deliberate. I straightened slightly in my seat, my fingers tightening just enough on the steering wheel to ground me in the present, and I understood then that what had happened was not just about being excluded from a single event. It was about control. Control over information, over decisions, over what was seen and what was not. And if that control had extended to something as final as a farewell, then it could just as easily extend to everything that came after. The meeting I had just left was not the beginning of this story. It was the continuation of something that had already been set in motion long before I realized I was no longer part of it. I took a slow breath, steady and measured, and turned the key in the ignition at last, the engine coming to life with a low, familiar hum. As I pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto the road, I did not look back at the building behind me. There was nothing there for me anymore. But for the first time, I was not driving away in confusion. I was driving forward with a question that no longer felt uncertain, only necessary. And somewhere deep inside, I knew I was going to find the answer, no matter how carefully it had been hidden. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had already begun to dim, the soft orange light fading into a quiet gray that settled over the neighborhood like a curtain closing on a day that had taken more from me than I had expected, and I sat in the car for a moment longer, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, letting the stillness return before I stepped back into a house that no longer felt the same. When I opened the front door, the familiar scent of polished wood and old books greeted me, unchanged, steady, almost stubborn in its refusal to acknowledge what had shifted, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to stand there, just inside the threshold, remembering how he used to look up from his chair when I came home, offering that small nod, that quiet smile that never needed words. I closed the door gently behind me and walked toward the living room, my steps slow but deliberate, as if each movement carried more weight now, more awareness than before. His chair was exactly where it had always been, angled slightly toward the window, the cushion still holding the faint impression of years of routine, and I reached out without thinking, resting my hand against the worn fabric, grounding myself in something that had not changed. For a long time, I had believed that what we built together was solid, not just the house or the furniture, but the structure of our lives, the way decisions were made, the way trust was shared without question. He handled the finances, the legal matters, the documents that required precision, and I handled everything else, the daily rhythm, the care, the continuity that kept a home from becoming just a place. It had always worked because we trusted each other completely, because there was never a reason to doubt that what was his was also mine, that what we created belonged to both of us equally. But standing there in that quiet room, I began to revisit that assumption, not with panic, not with regret, but with a calm curiosity that had not been there before. I turned and walked toward his study, a room I had rarely entered without him, not out of restriction, but out of respect for the way he liked to keep things ordered, his files aligned, his desk clear, his documents arranged with a precision that reflected the way his mind worked. The door opened with a soft creak, and the air inside felt slightly cooler, untouched, as if time had paused the moment he left it. I stepped in slowly, my eyes moving across the shelves, the neatly labeled folders, the framed certificates that spoke of a life built with intention and care. For years, I had trusted that everything in this room was exactly as it should be, that every decision he made here was done with clarity and foresight. Now, I was not so sure that everything had remained untouched after he was gone. I moved closer to the desk and ran my fingers lightly across the surface, noticing how clean it was, how recently it must have been organized. And that was when a small detail caught my attention, something so subtle it might have gone unnoticed before. One of the drawers, usually closed flush with the desk, was slightly misaligned, just enough to suggest it had been opened and shut without the usual care. I paused, my hand hovering for a moment before I pulled it open, revealing a row of files that looked familiar at first glance, but not quite right upon closer inspection. The labels were the same, the arrangement similar, but something about the order felt altered, as if the original structure had been recreated rather than preserved. I did not rush. I did not pull everything out or search frantically. Instead, I selected one folder at a time, opening it carefully, scanning the contents with the same patience he had always shown, allowing the details to reveal themselves rather than forcing them into place. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to see it. Documents that had been moved. Copies where originals should have been. Dates that did not align the way they should. Nothing obvious enough to raise immediate alarm, but enough to suggest that someone had been here, not once, but more than once, making adjustments that were meant to go unnoticed. I closed the drawer gently and stood there in the quiet, the realization settling over me not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet confirmation of what I had already begun to understand. This had not started at the funeral. It had not even started with the meeting. It had started here, in this room, in the small, careful changes that no one expected me to notice. And as I looked around the space that had once represented certainty, I felt that same cold clarity return, sharper now, more defined, because for the first time, I was no longer looking at my life as it had been. I was seeing it as it truly was. I did not put the files back right away because once you begin to see something that has been carefully hidden, it becomes impossible to simply close the drawer and pretend it was never there. So I stood at his desk a little longer, letting my eyes move across each detail again, slower this time, more deliberate, noticing things I had overlooked at first glance. The paper felt different in my hands, not physically, but in meaning, because these were no longer just documents he had organized during his lifetime. They were pieces of a story that had been quietly rewritten after he was gone. I selected another folder, this one labeled with a year I recognized immediately, and opened it carefully, keeping everything aligned the way I had found it, as if preserving the scene mattered, even though no one else was there to see it. Inside were copies of financial records, property documents, and a summary page that had been printed recently, the ink still sharp, the formatting slightly different from the older pages beneath it. That difference caught my attention, not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle, the kind of change most people would ignore without a second thought. I compared the pages side by side, holding them steady in the fading light coming through the window, and that was when I noticed the dates did not match the sequence they should have followed. A transfer listed on the summary page appeared before a corresponding document that should have authorized it, as if the order had been rearranged to suggest something that had not actually happened that way. I did not react outwardly. I simply placed the pages back in the folder and set it down, my movements slow and controlled, the same way I used to move when I did not want to wake Daniel as a child, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. But inside, the pattern was becoming clearer. This was not a single mistake. It was a series of small adjustments, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming something that felt intentional. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the quiet of the room settle around me, and another memory surfaced, one that had seemed ordinary at the time, but now carried a different weight. A few days before my husband passed, Vanessa had insisted on helping organize paperwork, saying she wanted to make things easier for everyone, her tone warm, her offer reasonable. I had agreed without hesitation, grateful for what I believed was kindness. I remembered the way she moved through this very room, opening drawers, asking questions, making notes, all with a calm efficiency that had impressed me then. Now, standing in the same space, I could almost trace her steps, see the places where she might have paused, the decisions she might have made when no one was watching. I walked over to the bookshelf and ran my fingers along the spines of the binders, each one labeled in his precise handwriting, each one representing years of careful management, and I realized something that settled deep and heavy in my chest. He had never been careless. He had never left things incomplete or unclear. If something appeared disordered now, it was not because of him. That understanding did not bring anger. It brought clarity. I returned to the desk and gently closed the drawer, aligning it properly this time, restoring the surface to the order it had once held, even if only temporarily. Then I stepped back, taking in the room as a whole, no longer as a place I had avoided out of respect, but as a place that now demanded attention. The quiet around me felt different than before, no longer empty, but filled with meaning, each detail carrying a significance I had not been willing to see until now. I turned toward the door, pausing for just a moment before stepping out, and as I did, I understood that whatever had been done here was only the beginning of something larger, something that extended beyond this room, beyond these files, into decisions that were already unfolding without me. But that would not continue unnoticed any longer, because now, I was no longer waiting for answers to come to me. I was going to find them myself. The next morning began earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind no longer allowed me the comfort of staying still, and by 6:15, I was already standing in the kitchen, watching the coffee drip into the pot, the slow, steady rhythm grounding me in a way that felt necessary now. I did not turn on the television. I did not reach for my phone. I let the quiet remain intact, because for the first time in days, I needed to think without interruption. I poured a cup and carried it to the small table by the window, the same place where I had once waited for calls that never came. But this time, I was not waiting. I was remembering. I thought about the way Vanessa had positioned herself during those last weeks. Always present, always helpful, always just a step ahead in conversations that did not belong to her. At the time, I had been grateful for her involvement, believing she was easing the burden for Daniel, giving him space to grieve. But now, when I replayed those moments carefully, I saw something different, something more controlled, more deliberate. She had not just been assisting. She had been guiding. Every question I asked had been redirected through her. Every answer had been filtered before it reached me. It was subtle enough that I had not resisted it, gentle enough that it had not felt like interference. That was what made it effective. I took a sip of coffee and set the cup down, my hand steady as I allowed the realization to settle deeper. This was not about a single decision or a single document. It was about access. Access to information, to timing, to the ability to shape what others saw and what they did not. And if she had that kind of access in the days before he passed, then she would have had it afterward as well. I stood up and walked back toward the hallway, my steps quiet against the hardwood floor, and paused outside Daniel's old room. The door still closed the way he used to leave it when he wanted privacy as a teenager. For a moment, I considered opening it, but I did not. Whatever I needed to understand was not in there. It was in the choices being made now, in the pattern that had already begun to form. I returned to the kitchen and picked up my purse, reaching inside for my phone, this time with intention. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not needed to call in years, someone my husband had trusted, someone who had always handled matters with discretion and clarity. I did not hesitate. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to the quiet ringing that followed, each tone marking the shift from uncertainty to action. When the voice on the other end answered, calm and professional, I felt something in my chest ease slightly, not relief, but alignment, as if I had stepped back into a role I had forgotten I could still occupy. I introduced myself without embellishment, stating my name, my connection, and the reason for my call in clear, measured words, the way I had heard my husband do countless times before. There was a brief pause, then recognition, followed by a tone that changed just enough to signal attention. I did not explain everything. I did not accuse anyone or speculate. I simply asked for a review, for a second set of eyes, for confirmation that what I was beginning to see was not just grief distorting my perception. The response was careful but willing, an agreement to meet, to look, to listen. When I ended the call, I did not feel triumphant. I felt focused. I placed the phone back into my purse and glanced once more around the kitchen, the light now stronger, the day fully awake, and I realized that whatever had been set in motion without me was no longer moving unchecked. Because now, I was paying attention, and that alone was enough to change everything. I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was anxious, but because I wanted to see the place before the conversation began, to take in the details without distraction, the same way I had learned to observe things more carefully now. The office building was smaller than I expected, quiet, with a narrow hallway lined with framed degrees and neatly arranged chairs that no one seemed to be using. And as I stepped inside, I noticed how different it felt from the place I had been escorted out of just days before. There was no tension here, no performance, no one watching to see how I would react. Just stillness, and the faint sound of papers being turned somewhere behind a closed door. When I gave my name at the front desk, the receptionist nodded with polite recognition, as if my presence made sense here, as if I belonged. That alone felt like a shift. I sat down and placed my purse on my lap, my hands resting lightly on top of it, steady, composed, the same way I had trained myself to be in moments that required patience. When the door opened and he stepped out, I recognized him. Immediately, not just from memory, but from the way he carried himself, measured, precise, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself. He greeted me with a calm nod and gestured for me to come in, and I followed without hesitation. The office was modest but organized, every document in its place, every surface clear, and as I sat across from him, I felt something settle into alignment, as if I had stepped into a space where things were meant to be understood rather than concealed. I did not begin with emotion. I did not describe how I felt or what had been done to me. Instead, I spoke the way my husband would have, clearly, directly, outlining the sequence of events, the absence of communication, the meeting I had been removed from, and the documents I had found that did not match the order they should have followed. He listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but attentive, his eyes focused not on me, but on the information itself, as if assembling it piece by piece in his mind. When I finished, there was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful, and then he reached for a notepad, writing something down with slow, deliberate strokes before looking up again. He did not react with surprise. He did not dismiss what I had said. Instead, he asked a question, simple, precise, one that cut directly to the center of everything. Do you have access to the original documents? I paused for a moment, considering the files I had seen, the differences I had noticed, and I answered honestly. I have access to what is currently there. He nodded slightly, as if that distinction mattered, and leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk. That may not be the same thing, he said, his tone calm but firm, and something in those words settled heavily, because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand but had not yet fully allowed myself to accept. I reached into my purse and took out the notes I had made, the details I had written down the night before, dates, discrepancies, observations that had seemed small at the time, but now formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. I placed them on the desk in front of him, and he reviewed them carefully, his eyes moving from one line to the next, occasionally pausing, occasionally making a small mark beside something that stood out. The room remained quiet, the only sound the faint movement of paper and the distant hum of activity outside, and I sat there without speaking, without rushing, allowing the process to unfold at its own pace. After a few minutes, he set the papers down and looked at me again, his expression unchanged but his attention sharper now, more focused. There are inconsistencies here, he said, not as a conclusion, but as a confirmation, and I felt a subtle shift inside me, not relief, not satisfaction, but clarity becoming something solid, something undeniable. He did not elaborate further, did not offer immediate solutions or dramatic statements. Instead, he outlined the next steps, the need to review official records, to compare filings, to verify timelines that could not be altered without leaving some trace behind. Each word was measured, each suggestion grounded in process rather than assumption, and I listened carefully, absorbing every detail, because this was no longer about suspicion. It was about proof. When the meeting ended, I stood and thanked him, my voice steady, my posture unchanged, and as I stepped back into the hallway, the quiet there felt different than before, no longer empty, but purposeful, as if every step forward now carried direction instead of doubt. I walked out of the building without looking back, the afternoon air cool against my face, and for the first time since everything had begun to unravel, I understood that what had been hidden was not beyond reach. It had simply been placed where no one expected me to look, and that assumption was about to be tested. By the time I returned home, the light had shifted again, softer now, stretching across the floors in long, quiet lines that made everything look unchanged at first glance. And yet nothing felt the same as it had even the day before, because once you begin to see patterns, you cannot unsee them. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. Not heavy anymore, not suffocating, but steady, like a space that finally belonged to me again. I did not rush back into his study right away. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water, took a slow sip, and let my thoughts move carefully through everything that had been said, everything that had been confirmed. Inconsistencies. That was the word that stayed with me. Not dramatic, not emotional, but precise. The kind of word that did not rely on interpretation, only on fact. I set the glass down and walked down the hallway. My steps quieter now, more intentional, as if I was no longer entering that room as someone uncertain, but as someone who understood exactly what needed to be done. When I opened the door to the study again, the air felt different, not because the room had changed, but because I had. I moved directly to the desk and opened the drawer I had examined the night before, this time without hesitation, pulling out the folders one by one and placing them neatly on the surface, creating a space where I could see everything clearly. I did not skim. I did not assume. I read each page carefully, aligning dates, cross-referencing names, noticing the small details that had once seemed insignificant. And slowly, the inconsistencies began to form a clearer structure. Transfers that appeared before authorization. Copies where originals should have been. Signatures that matched too perfectly across documents that should have been created at different times. Nothing overtly false. Nothing that would immediately draw attention, but enough to suggest that something had been adjusted after the fact. I reached for another folder, this one tucked slightly farther back, and as I opened it, I noticed something I had not seen before, a document that had been placed between older pages, its paper newer, its edges sharper. I lifted it carefully and held it up to the light, scanning the contents with a steady gaze. It was a summary statement, listing assets, distributions, final allocations, all neatly organized, all appearing complete. But there was a detail that did not align with what I remembered, a figure that seemed slightly different, not dramatically so, but enough to stand out once I focused on it. I lowered the paper and compared it with another document from an earlier file, and the difference became clearer, subtle, but undeniable. I did not react outwardly. I simply set both papers side by side and studied them, allowing the contrast to confirm what I was beginning to understand. This was not just about access anymore. This was about outcome, about shaping not only what was seen, but what would ultimately be accepted as truth. I placed the documents back in their respective folders, but this time, I did not return them to the drawer. Instead, I stacked them neatly on the desk, separating the ones that aligned from the ones that did not, creating two distinct groups that reflected two very different versions of the same story. I stepped back and looked at them for a moment, the quiet of the room pressing in gently, not as a weight, but as a presence that allowed me to think clearly. For years, I had trusted that everything here had been handled with care, with honesty, with the same integrity my husband had always shown. Now, I understood that trust had been used as a cover, something that allowed changes to happen without question, without resistance. I turned toward the window, the fading light casting a soft reflection of the room behind me, and I saw it then, not as a collection of documents, but as a structure that had been carefully altered piece by piece, each change small enough to avoid detection, but together forming something entirely different from what had originally been intended. I took a slow breath and let it out evenly, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my posture steady, because there was no longer any uncertainty left to hold on to. The question was no longer whether something had been changed. The question was how far it went, and who had been counting on me not to notice. And as I stood there, looking at the two versions laid out in front of me, I realized that whatever came next would not be about confrontation or explanation. It would be about evidence, about clarity, about bringing into the light what had been carefully kept in the shadows. And that process had already begun. That night, I did not put the documents away, not because I was careless, but because I wanted them to remain exactly where they were, visible, undeniable, a quiet reminder that what I had seen was real and not something I could dismiss once the room grew dark. I turned off the overhead light and left only the small lamp on the corner of the desk, its warm glow casting soft shadows across the two separate stacks of paper, making the difference between them even more pronounced. I stood there for a moment, looking at them not as numbers or legal terms, but as choices, as decisions that had been made in my absence, decisions that had assumed I would never look closely enough to question them. I did not feel anger. I did not feel the sharp sting of betrayal the way I might have expected. What I felt instead was a quiet, steady awareness that something had shifted permanently, not just in my family, but in the way I understood it. I stepped out of the study and closed the door behind me, not to shut it away, but to hold that space intact, untouched, until I was ready to return with purpose rather than discovery. The house was silent, the kind of silence that used to feel comforting but now felt deliberate, as if it had been waiting for me to catch up to what had already changed. I moved through the hallway slowly, my hand brushing lightly against the wall as I passed, grounding myself in the familiar layout, the same path I had walked for decades without ever questioning where it led. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the black dress still folded neatly where I had left it days ago, the fabric smooth, untouched, a reminder of a moment I had been excluded from without explanation. I reached out and ran my fingers across it once, then withdrew my hand, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that the meaning of that moment had already settled into something deeper than a single event. I lay back briefly, staring at the ceiling, letting my thoughts move without interruption, and one idea returned again and again, not as a question, but as a conclusion. They had counted on my silence. Not just my absence, but my silence. The assumption that I would accept what I was given, that I would not ask, not look, not challenge what had been arranged in rooms I was no longer invited into. That assumption had shaped everything. It had allowed them to move forward without resistance, to make adjustments without scrutiny, to create a version of events that would stand unchallenged. I sat up slowly and looked around the room, at the photographs on the dresser, at the life we had built piece by piece, and I realized something that felt both simple and undeniable. That version of events only held as long as I remained outside of it. I stood and walked back toward the study, opening the door again without hesitation, the soft light still illuminating the desk exactly as I had left it, the two stacks of documents waiting, unchanged, patient. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, this time with intention, not to isolate the room, but to define it as a place where things would be understood clearly. I moved to the desk and placed my hands lightly on either side of the papers, not touching them, but acknowledging their presence, their weight, the role they would now play in everything that followed. I did not need to rush. I did not need to confront anyone or demand answers that could still be avoided. What I needed now was precision, the same precision that had been used to create these inconsistencies, but applied in a way that would reveal rather than conceal. I turned off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness for the night, not as an ending, but as a pause, a deliberate space between what had been discovered and what would be done next. As I walked back down the hallway, I felt that same steady clarity settle in again, stronger now, more defined, because there was no longer any part of me waiting to be included or acknowledged. That was no longer the role I occupied. And as I reached the bedroom door and paused for just a moment before stepping inside, one thought moved through my mind with quiet certainty, clear and complete. They believed I had come to that meeting to be dismissed. They believed I had already been left behind. But what they did not understand, what they had never considered, was that I had not gone there to be heard. I had gone there to see. And now that I had, everything they had built on that assumption was already beginning to come undone.